today's executives want to leverage the power of AI to help them solve business-critical problems and enable predictability in decision-making processes. Both enterprise and consumers' intelligence is the next revolution after digital. Every ambitious company wants to bring intelligent systems to their organization. I think we're getting that sense of urgency from our talks today. However, as everyone is learning with mobile, digital, etc., this will not be easy. And if Google said it was difficult, then how is it going to be for the rest of us, quite clearly? It goes beyond technology and requires a transformation of people, process, in equal degree. We've heard that culture and people is hugely important too. Just a little bit of background before I go on to questions. We've just heard today that the ways in industry and in government is facing the challenges and opportunity presented by AI. We're here today to explore what this means for all sorts of organisations to become intelligent businesses. There is still a lot of confusion among senior managers out there as to how to harness the opportunity brought by AI and not robot it, as Kit said. And of course, the role of intelligence along digital transformation in creating digital guided businesses. So I'm going to start just with a quick 30-second answer from each panellist, if I may. We've heard about culture and understanding being really important, but what is it about culture and capability that businesses need to develop to become data guided? Emer, if I could start with you.
Yeah, well, I think the leading with integrity piece that Kit mentioned just now is very important, and I think one of the issues that a lot of organisations have is that those who are very senior may not be technology adopters themselves, and so they don't know what they don't know. And with sort of, enterprise IT sitting over here, not bringing tech right into the centre of the organisation. So I think we need a new generation of digitally savvy leaders.
New leaders coming through, that's great. Gavin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you need to combine the poets with the scientists. You still need to have people with creativity and empathy, and machines don't do empathy really well, so humour, they're all important things, and you have to learn as a culture to build a framework that enables people to express themselves and also to quickly learn when they're making mistakes through being able to test. As these models evolve, I'm not sure, the title here is Embedding Artificial Intelligence. I'm not sure when we're going to get to a point of having true artificial intelligence, and it depends on one's definition. But certainly the ability for models to begin to forecast based on really large data sets is changing how people make decisions. And I for one, am very excited by that, but I just want to say, don't lose the creativity. It's an important part of life.
I love you saying that the poetry and the science has to go together. It's a lovely analogy. Mark, your 30 seconds on culture and capability and blending them.
I think we find at heart that treating decision-making as a product, as a collaborative discipline, is really the critical change to enable folks to become more data-guided or ultimately intelligent, especially in a generalized AI intelligence sense. And so we see people adopting this. I think Kit cited this in her organization in different ways. It's that collaboration around a very simple structure that can then be matured. And people do it in their different and own creative ways, but I think it's that moment which makes the change for an organization in that journey.
Thank you. I think to summarize that, I think we've also heard this morning that data is nothing without the human element. Indeed, thank you. Emer, I'm going to come to you if I may. Your experience at Transport for London was to engage them to help understand the benefits of open data. I think we're all hugely curious to know, how did you manage to convince 4 authorities to release their data to you?
Well, it probably helps that I'm not a shrinking violet, I would say, given the nature of the organisations. I'm thinking about it, it was nearly 10 years ago, which is a long time. And at that time, there was very little policy work that could wrap around releasing public sector data. And I was really fortunate that I found the work of a guy called David Eves from Canada, who had 3 laws of open data, and which were, if it can't be spidered or indexed, it doesn't exist. In other words, if it's not findable. If it's not machine readable, it can't engage. And if there's no legal framework around it, it can't empower. And that made it incredibly easy to explain, actually, at the time. So there was a simplicity in that wasn't bound up with a whole lot of policy and restrictions. So it was saying, basically make it findable, make it usable, and empower people. And so that was what I did, was basically just to try and get them to do that. And clearly, for Transport for London, that was really difficult because they were used to having a very high level of control. And so their worry was, what's going to happen? We're not going to be the centre. We're not going to be the controlling factor. What if the data's wrong? What if people use it incorrectly? So a lot of it was trying to get them to understand, and I think it's great credit to them that at that early stage they were prepared to do that. But it wasn't without some serious, hand-to-hand combat, shall we say.
So is the brave decision actually to encourage organisations not to be, guarding the data and to be more liberal with it?
I mean, I think one of the things that was, my point to Transport for London was, release the data, don't build an app. Your expertise is not around design, right? It may be we've evolved in government services now where design might have been, but at that point, was to say your job is to make that data open and let the market innovate, let the market do what it does best. And I'm sure many of you have Citymapper as an app, for example. I mean, there's just no way Transport for London would have been able to create a thing of beauty, which Citymapper is. So that was the real leap of faith for them to say, you just do what you're good at, being fantastic at collecting and maintaining that data, and then let the market innovate. So that was the strategy, really.
Isn't it, as businesses, we're great at collecting data, we're not very good at doing anything
Correct.
with it. So that led to the London Data Store being created. So how did this become to be recognised as the official platform for this data?
Well, because one of the other sides of things I think that is important in this is to be transparent about what you're doing. And I think Dave mentioned earlier about trust or being trustworthy. And so, a lot of the developer community at the time didn't trust Transport for London as much because they'd been trying to get data for years and they weren't getting anywhere. So in the data store, we blogged very openly about the process, about our process of engagement. And then, at one point I remember saying to Transport for London, you should be blogging, you should be blogging and talking about what you're doing. And they were like, oh, no, we're okay, we're quite happy for you to do it in the data store. So that became a kind of a neutral broker, if you like, between sort of the city and the developer community with Transport for London feeding in.
It's interesting. Do you think business gets a sense that they're frightened of data?
I think it's largely a control issue. It stems back to that management of we must have control over everything. And I mean, the fact is we have control over nothing, really, when we see where we are now in geopolitics and democracy. So I think it's that, being more easy to say, we can, I'll give you a brief example. So at one point in City Hall, we ourselves were releasing financial data. And one of the developers said, you're not releasing it in a way that we can compare apples with apples, right? Because your spreadsheets are different every month. Now, normally that would have been a big gotcha moment, in City Hall. And I was like, oh, cool, I'll get the finance department to do it differently, right? So it's about being relaxed with people saying, hey, you need to fix that, and going, great, thank you for pointing that out, rather than thinking, everything has to be perfect because, don't let, go ugly early is what we used to say in City Hall.
The Ministry of No.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course. So we've seen recent data breaches across many sectors. With this in mind, how can businesses build a strong trust relationship with customers and the general public? And Emer, you were touching on that. I'd love you to explore that a bit more.
So I thought I was going to address that question to Gavin. I think, again, it's explaining to people, I think, why you need their data, how you're protecting it, that you can need to demonstrate your best efforts, right? I mean, I think, when we see casualness with regard to data, we blame companies. When we think you could have just worked harder to protect what's mine. And so I think that's quite important, is that you are transparent. And so when things happen, as they will, I mean, there will always be data breaches, you can give an assurance to the public that you did everything possible. But I also think from the consumer side, we need to understand it is going to be breached. I mean, that's what technology, that's the sort of reality of technology is there's always going to be a smarter hacker. So I think it's about how comfortable are we, in our data being used, and, how comfortable are we to think what happens if it's, if it's breached. So I do think there's a bit of maturity, I think, has to happen, both on the consumer side and the business side.
Indeed. I'll move to Gavin, because obviously, Gavin, you're heavily involved with legislation, etc. So when it comes to data breaches and protecting data and permissions, how does that work now in this new digital economy?
Yes, the hardest nut to crack in planning this out was the liability model. And we see time and again markets across the world that want to leap to the technology without having properly thought through the market requirements. So I completely agree with Emer. There's a certainty at some point some entity is going to have a significant data loss. It just happens. So, and we should do everything we can to stop that. It's not that we don't put up adequate defences and that we don't invest in that. But we have to also understand that the customer has to be made whole. They have to be looked after. They can't suffer the consequences of the data loss and just be left to face whatever happens. So it's really important, you have to start thinking about concepts like traceability. In open banking, which has lots of great customer benefits, we have two certainties of custodianship. One is the customer, and the other is the originating institution, for example, the large incumbent bank, just as an example. But there could be, through the right of sharing data, because the customers wanted a particular service, dozens, maybe hundreds of companies that are holding the same data set. And any of those could have some penetration. So during the negotiating rounds of the Payment Services Directive that underpin open banking, we put a bit of thought into that, and we said, you know what, some of these fintechs operate relatively thin balance sheets. They're thin operating models anyway. They don't have the big capital requirements that the big banks have sitting behind them to look after the customer. And in fact, the big banks aren't particularly good at pricing risk, and the insurance sector is maybe a better equipped. So we transferred the liability model in Europe from being a contingent liability on the balance sheet of the banking system, or the other option was nobody knows what's going to happen, right? That was a genuine option, to being a requirement for all of the fintechs that get the data to have adequate cyber risk insurance in place specifically for that reason. But it comes with a number of other things and design choices, because whereas the second Payment Services Directive that underpins European open banking did pretty well on the legal and regulatory framework, it had an absolute shocker on thinking through what the technical requirements would be, because it enabled every bank in Europe, and there are 6,000, just to put it in context, that are in the what they call the ASPSP, which is any payment institution, so it includes wallets and credit card providers. It enabled any of them to find their own method of addressing it. Now, you then end up in a situation where every bank in that role could potentially build their own plug socket. And therefore, every time you buy an appliance, you come along, you have to wire it in directly. What we've been campaigning for is a standardized based approach to that, a standard API, a common security profile, one where the cyber risk insurance market and the regulator could look at it and say, right, we've all agreed that this is what good looks like. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be a direct attack into the fintech company, but the process of sharing data has got a common standardized method of the data flowing, and particularly of making sure that there was recognition between the regulated actors. So only regulated actors can access the data, so we know that they're properly insured and adequately prepared. And also in the middle, we put in place this, in the UK model, we put in place this directory, and the directory knows who the actors are and makes sure that when the API is set up, that they can adequately and cohesively identify who's getting the data. So yeah, we've had to try to retrofit the standards-based approach, which wasn't there to start with, which I think was a deep regret. It should have been more clear in the market.
Understood. So with the levelling of the governance of the process, how is it that there are new disruptors coming on the market and leveraging AI in a more customer-centric way, far better than some of the large incumbents?
Sure. Well, the typical process is that somebody somewhere has an idea, and it could be that the idea has been personal to them. It's a personal pain point. That's often creates some kind of impetus for people to innovate and for entrepreneurs to come to the market with ideas. They've been able to look at the availability of this data and start to think about, if we really understood how humans behaved from how they earn to how they distribute their income to how that leads to better or worse positions, and you can take that and collectivize a large set of data, you can start to figure out and really properly test hyper-personalized solutions for each individual customer. I think if you go back through time and you go back for a very long period, hundreds of years, these things have tended to be manufactured as products and not necessarily designed around customer-orientated solutions. So I think the long-term play here is for this data to deeply understand what each customer needs, put them in the context of what happened to other people in slightly similar situations, and then evolve much more efficient, I think is the key word, methods of getting those outcomes.
Indeed. So everyone in this room is impacted by having to protect data and keep it safe, and obviously be compliant to regulation. GDPR is probably the universal one. How do incumbents remain compliant and competitive? If we're all doing the same thing, how do you get competitive advantage?
Well, you need a bit of poetry.
Comes back down to humans again then, doesn't it?
It's really down to having teams of people who are laser focused on customers and what the customers need. And obviously, it's my belief that good cultures stem from that, because if your culture is genuinely wanting to have good outcomes for customers, the regulation can be very, very thin, because in everything you do, and your DNA as an organization, you're not trying to work to the customer's detriment to the benefit of your shareholders. You're not trying to, do them over. You're trying to find ways of creating win-wins all across your relationship. And I think the capability that we've got now, the fact, there's obviously lots of genuine technical advances which have underpinned what you can do. And I'm seeing far more focus in people thinking, well, our straight competitive advantage here is that we are focusing really clearly on solving a particular problem or series of problems. And for some of the smaller and newer organizations that aren't dealing with a lot of legacy stuff, they sometimes get round to those answers in a speedier way because of both processes and technology. And for the large organizations that are already sitting on huge war chests of data that they've already collected, they have an advantage of existing customers and lots of data. If they can just free themselves up a little bit, they can get back in the race too. And hopefully the combination of that great competition to help solve customer problems will drive the innovation ever faster.
Great, appreciate that. Mark, in large organisations, we've heard today that the big organisations, legacy organisations, tend to be siloed. How do organisations go about breaking down those silos, de-siloing and actually servicing data?
Picking up on Gavin's point, there's a significant opportunity for large incumbents to make the best use of both their audience, their customers, and the data set that they already have. So this question is possibly the question posed most often, right? People want the magic sauce, the strangler pattern to escape from those mentality blocks, the ministry of no that they experience today in their business, and to move to a slightly more disruptive, fast-moving state. I think if we look at the pattern of some of the more advanced disruptors, and one business we're interacting with today would be Babylon Health, for example, and they might be typical, is businesses today who are trying to be intelligence at core, intelligence-led businesses, tend to expose that in a couple of ways. One is about the people, and the other is the process often embodied in the architecture, because they're building some things today, and they have the advantage of doing it on a greenfield basis. They tend to build things that are responsive as systems and take in insight and learnings in short loops and don't need human interference to produce a decision back, whether it's for a consumer or it's in some greater business decision-making process. And this comes back to the point that Gavin was making around how can you serve the customer. That ability to test and learn quickly means that they're very agile in making the intelligence relevant, either on a general basis or one-point interface for the customer they're trying to serve. That often exposes as a team that comes together around kind of three core competencies we tend to see. One is, sure, data science, the ability to be extremely well disciplined in your use of data, statistical significance, how you execute. One is engineering capability, and we might expect that. The ability to actually productionize these things. They work, they don't go down, they're reliable. And they're true to the view of the data scientist. They're true to the algorithm intended, the learning path intended. There's a big difference between being able to come up with the concept, even a working proof of concept, and execute that at scale. But the third one, and I think this speaks to the points earlier, is the ability to frame decision-making as an optimization problem. Kit mentioned that. So to take all those highly paid people, all the commercial market makers, all the people checking what our consumer experience is, and allow them to bring all of their nuanced judgments in with that team and expose them as optimization problems. And be open to that and relaxed with that and have an experimental attitude. Obviously, startups who are disruptors have the opportunity of starting afresh and having close relationships, networks between these people. I think one of the keys tends to be that large incumbents who are making the best progress, whether it be in government or in the private sector, are replicating some of that DNA in their organization. So bringing together people who own a whole load of problem sets, but believe in treating them to the extent possible as an optimization problem, and they're embedding that with both engineering and data science. And by bringing those three things together, they can